So, I want to talk about something. A handful of years ago, I published my first ever graphic novel, Forget Me Not Aconite. It's a story that's very near and dear to my heart, and it's something that I'm very proud of given what I was going through at the time I was writing it. I made a few videos in 2021 talking about the characters, as well as a couple of reels and a lot of art pieces. But then I kind of just stopped. I stopped talking about it, I stopped sharing it. I prioritized working on other projects, and in a few short months, Forget Me Not Aconite is going to be 5 years old. And I'm not gonna lie, saying that out loud has me feeling a lot of different feelings right now, if I can be quite frank. So, I want to start talking about Forget Me Not again. It's such an important part of my life and who I am that it honestly feels kind of criminal that I let it fall to the wayside like this. So, allow me to indulge myself, reconnect with this story, and explain to you what the heck is Forget Me Not? Before we dive into things proper, I want to say a little bit about the piece that I'm working on in this video. Very recently, I have found some time to create artwork for myself that is not tied to any of my existing projects, and of course, I decided to draw something related to my project anyway. This piece is actually going to be connected to Forget Me Not's prequel, which is currently in the works. And it gives you just a really quick glimpse into what the main characters' lives were like before the events of book one. Recently, I've gotten very into pieces that have characters interacting with each other within an environment. This is actually the second one I'm working on. The first one was the main character and his girlfriend sitting by a gas station with some late night snacks. It was adorable. But that being said, you're only going to see the line art part of this art piece because the sketching was done over 2 separate days, and the line art alone took exactly 2 hours and 30 minutes I recorded. My line art takes a long time because I technically do line art 2.5 times, once and then a second time for line variation, and then I fill in the blanks between those 2 bits of line art. It's kind of weird, you'll see it in the video, but I think it looks nice. Alright, let's get on with the actual topic of the video now. I want you guys to consider this video as sort of a primer for the graphic novel itself. We're going to go over the characters, the plot, a little bit about the world, and so on. There are going to be mindless spoilers, but I'm going to try and keep it light and to the first few chapters of the comic so that there's nothing too serious happening in this video. If you want to read the comic yourself, either before or after watching this video, links to the main webpage and all of the mirrors are in the description below. And if you really want to support the comic and the development of its sequel, because yes, on top of the prequel, there is going to be a sequel and a third book attached to this series, then consider becoming a patron or even buying a physical copy of the book. Links to those pages are also going to be in the description. Alright, now we can finally get started talking about the book itself. So first, a quick synopsis of the story. Forget Me Not is a zombie apocalypse story centered around Caden, a 20-something-year-old college kid with a lot of mental struggles after he does something pretty tragic and also pretty drastic on page 1. He's traveling alone for a while until he's reunited with his friend from before the apocalypse, Siobhan, and traveling with Siobhan is another old connection that Caden isn't nearly as excited to see again. And that's Haley. Caden and Haley have a bit of a checkered past with each other from before the apocalypse, and Caden never really fully got to process his feelings towards Haley after those events. Haley, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have any memory of Caden being a part of her life whatsoever. Stranded and now completely alone in the world, Caden has to try and get along with Haley as the trio travels the country in their car with whatever supplies they manage to find along the way. On the road, tensions will constantly change and rise as Siobhan attempts to keep the peace between her 2 remaining friends, and Caden grows more and more conflicted and more guilty of his own actions and feelings towards the situation. At its core, Forget Me Not is a story about trauma, specifically the negative ways that trauma can influence a person. It's a story that I started playing with in the background amidst my own life-changing events, and as things continue to happen in my life, it slowly started to take more and more form. I'm really sorry if you can hear my heater in the background. It's really cold in here, and I would rather be nice and toasty than freeze my ass off for you guys. Fun fact, Caden and Haley went through a couple of different iterations before I landed on this one. There was one where Caden and Haley were demigods, and there was another where Caden and Haley were both embodiments of life and death, with Haley being life and Caden being death. But truth be told, I thought that was really cringy and unnecessary, and very quickly those versions of these characters got scrapped. I'd actually scrapped Caden, Haley, and Siobhan all together for a while because the demigod and the life and death plot weren't working, and I couldn't figure out how to get these characters to work in a story. And then I discovered Telltale's The Walking Dead, and everything changed. It was like things just magically fell into place the day I discovered that game. The next video I upload this month is supposed to be sort of a sketchbook doodle flip-through thing where I show you guys the development of the Forget-Me-Not characters in my sketchbooks. The thing with that is I didn't put them in one specific sketchbook, they're scattered throughout multiple sketchbooks, so that's gonna be fun. Maybe I have some concept art of Caden and Haley as the demigods. I don't actually remember if that ever left the conceptualization phase and I started drawing them or not, so I guess we'll have to wait and see. Speaking of these characters and how they've changed and developed over the years, why don't we start talking about their current iterations in a little bit more depth now? I'm going to try and go in as spoiler-free as possible and avoid any prequel or sequel stuff since neither of those books are out yet, but I may have to talk about some of those events just to kind of provide context for what's happening. So once again, final warning, if you want to go into the story completely blind, links to book 1 are going to be in the description. Now let's talk about my boy. Caden is the main character of the story, and majority of the story takes place in his own head and through his perspective, so he's going to be the one that we talk about first. I mentioned in my original This Is Caden video that Caden is a character who I love as a character but hate as a real-life person. And while not everything in that video is necessarily canon anymore, a handful of it still sticks around. Caden is someone with a lot of feelings, and not a lot of healthy ways to understand or cope with said feelings. Before the apocalypse, he was incredibly chill and sweet, but as the world fell apart around him, things started to change. He's been through so much in such a short amount of time that not only is he struggling to cope with his new feelings, but a lot of old feelings that he had buried in the past are now starting to resurface, and he doesn't quite know how to deal with all of that. Unfortunately, at least in book 1, you guys don't really get to see Caden for who he was. Readers meet Caden the moment his emotional burden becomes too much, and he's already regressed into becoming a vindictive victim. A big aspect of Caden that is a direct result of his world falling apart around him is how he thinks. See, Caden is always first and foremost thinking about how things are going to impact him and his life and his decisions, which allows him to justify making some questionable and sometimes downright bad choices. He doesn't necessarily mean to hurt anyone, he just doesn't really think about how what he does will affect the people around him because he's all about self-preservation at this point. He also struggles a lot when it comes to letting things go. He's able to move on with his life when things happen to him, but the feelings that come from those events, the fear, the anger, the resentment, those kind of feelings don't really disappear for Caden. They linger within him and they continue to fester as time goes on. Despite moving on with his life after he went no contact with Haley pre-apocalypse era, and despite having a stable, happy, and healthy relationship with his new girlfriend Callie, there was still a lot of things that happened that he just couldn't forgive Haley for. And all of that comes crashing right back down in full force when Haley re-enters the picture. Caden, at his core, is a man in grieving. He's just done something that no person should ever have to go through, completely detaching himself from any positive feelings or sense of stability he had to the old world in the process, and he doesn't really know how or even if he can carry on having done what he's done. But with that being said, how many of his words and actions can be excused by grief and trauma before it goes too far and he victimizes someone else? Speaking of someone else, let's move on to the main point of contention in the story, Haley. Now, Haley, for lack of a better term, would be considered Caden's foil. Unlike Caden, who was worn down by the apocalypse and who has lost sight of who he really is along the way, Haley has maintained her personality in this new world. She's fun, she's outgoing, she's inclusive. She's the one trying to keep morale up for the trio despite what Caden says and feels about her, both in private and directly to her face. She's also the main reason that the trio is traveling across the country in the first place. Haley and Siobhan reconnected shortly after the apocalypse kicked into gear, and Siobhan's love for Haley and the want to keep a familiar face around is what made her join Haley in her travels. She feels even though the world is at its end, there's still so much to see and experience, and choosing to stay in a stronghold is the equivalent of being a sitting duck awaiting for your death. She doesn't merely want to survive, she wants to live. However, while she didn't lose sight of who she truly was like Caden did, there is something she lost. Her memory. Allegedly. I know me saying allegedly right there might be a point of confusion, but that's because the way Haley's memory loss works is inherently confusing. Sometimes she can't remember past interactions at all, and sometimes she can remember past events clearly, except for the parts that Caden was directly involved in. Caden has trouble believing this whole memory loss story because the only parts Haley seems to not be able to remember are the parts that directly involve him, and Siobhan believes the memory story wholeheartedly because this is her friend who she loves and cares about. Who's correct here? Who knows? I mean, I know because I wrote it and I know whether or not it's true or false, but that's for you guys to decide. Another trait about Haley which makes her conflict with Caden so interesting is her willingness to forgive and to try to understand where people are coming from on a deeper level. She seemingly doesn't seem to know why Caden has such strong feelings against her, but she's determined to get him to open up and develop a deeper bond with him. Even when Caden is blatantly downplaying her feelings and shutting her down, she always makes an effort to communicate with him, and is willing to forgive him for the things he says and does as time goes on. She understands that Caden is grieving, and even though they butt heads a lot, she's willing to give him some leeway because of that grief, while also not being afraid to let him know when she thinks he's going too far, especially when someone else's safety is at stake. Alright, next up is Siobhan, and Siobhan is essentially the entire reason the trio is even together to begin with. Despite Caden and Haley's checkered past and their constant struggles to get along, Siobhan is a mutual friend to both of them, and if they both want Siobhan in their lives as the world turns to shit, then they need to learn to deal with each other as well. Siobhan is the most level-headed of the group. She's been a confidant to both Caden and Haley since their platonic breakup before the apocalypse, and is often calling them both out when they're out of line with each other. That being said, on the rare occasion that Caden and Haley are on the same page, they both quickly disregard any advice that Siobhan has, choosing to confide in each other rather than her. She's a kind and gentle soul who, more than anything, just wants her two friends to get along so they can spend whatever final moments they have together. But again, she's very, very willing to call them out on their bullshit. Speaking of bullshit, Siobhan is also the kind of person who actively avoids swearing. Instead of using curse words, she'll resort to saying the word fig, like the literal fruit fig, and generally sticks to that unless tensions are too high for her. You know a situation is bad when Siobhan says fuck or shit. She's also the most sensitive of the group, but in a different way to Caden and Haley. See, those two are sensitive in the sense that they are privy to their own feelings and they try very hard to protect their peace, whereas Siobhan takes everyone's sensitivities into account, and when she makes decisions, she's generally thinking of the group as a whole and not just herself, which is more than Caden and Haley can say for themselves. She's also the kind of sensitive person that wears her heart on her sleeve. It's very easy to tell how Siobhan is thinking or feeling in any given situation. She is quite literally incapable of masking, despite her best efforts. She doesn't get very angry or raise her voice very often, but when she does, she's very quick to try and reclaim her role as the level-headed peacemaker of the group, because she knows that without her influence, Caden and Haley will quite literally implode on each other. Unfortunately, most of the spotlight Siobhan gets in this book is putting Caden or Haley in their place and trying to keep them united and safe, so she doesn't really have a lot of development outside of that right now. Siobhan really does get her time to shine in book 2, however, because in that book she evolves from a secondary character into a main character, and because of that she gets a lot of growth that I can't wait for you guys to see. I might do another what the heck is type of video when book 2 comes out, and if I do, I'll be introducing all of the new characters as well as existing ones that are being reintroduced, so there'll definitely be more to say about Siobhan in that video when the time comes. Alright, that's all the characters in Forget Me Not 1. It's a small cast, I know, but I really wanted time with these characters, so I kept the cast as small as possible. But now, I want to talk about the world and the inspirations for it a little bit. I mentioned earlier in the video that Forget Me Not is a zombie story, and the sole reason for that decision is Telltale's The Walking Dead. I discovered that game series in around 2018 to 2019, and I very, very quickly grew attached to the concept. It actually simultaneously reminded me of two really fond memories from just a couple of years prior. It reminded me a lot of a zombie-themed Minecraft server that I used to play on a lot with some of my friends back in 2016, and there was a zombie story tied to that server that one of those friends was writing at the time. Henry, I don't know if you're watching this video, but I really, really liked that story. It was really fun. And the other thing that it reminded me of was actually a Fire Emblem AU that I put that same friend group into. I know The Walking Dead and Fire Emblem are two very, very different worlds, but the Fire Emblem AU comics that I used to draw were basically support chats between our self-insert characters. We were building that AU one conversation at a time, very similarly to how the story in The Walking Dead develops one conversation at a time. I'm actually working on developing parts of that Fire Emblem AU into its own story with my own characters rather than the self-inserts, but that's another story for another time. Seeing how the zombie setting changed how people think, how it impacted others, and how things carried over from the normal world really intrigued me, and I wanted to take a crack at it myself. It saved these characters from being stuck in a purgatory, a forever unfinished state. It breathed life into these characters that I had completely given up on. I can't explain the feeling. Like I said earlier in the video, everything just kind of clicked into place. Mostly, the zombies are used as a way to keep the characters moving forward, keep them stuck together, and elevate the stakes of each fight that they have. But as the series goes on, I have a lot more fun ideas and interesting ways that I want to incorporate the zombie setting into each character's individual lives. There's also a lot of fun psychological elements to the story, as most of the events occur from Caden's perspective and in his brain, like I mentioned at the start of the video, so you get to see the mental gymnastics he has to do in order to maintain his preconceived thoughts and views about the situation, and about Haley as a whole. You also get to see how he struggles when contradictory things are said or shown to him, and I think that's really fun. This was before I discovered and fell in love with the Silent Hill franchise, so there are no horror elements to the psychological aspect of the story, but don't you worry, there will be soon enough. I do also want to nip this in the bud really, really quick before we continue on. I am not going to disclose the origin of the zombie fungus in this story. In book 2, you guys will get to see the fungus and learn a little bit about how it develops and how it creates zombies, but I am never ever going to disclose the origin of this fungus. The reason for that, funnily enough, also has to do with The Walking Dead, but not Telltale's version. I'm talking about the original Walking Dead. I don't know how or why, but Robert Kirkman, creator of The Walking Dead, disclosed a while ago that the origin of the zombie virus in his story is aliens, and words cannot express how inherently upset I got from having that information, and how having that information fundamentally ruined aspects of The Walking Dead for me. I cannot enjoy The Walking Dead unless I actively choose to not acknowledge the fact that the virus came from aliens. I don't know why I feel this way, but it's because I feel this way that I am never going to disclose the origin of the Forget-Me-Not zombie fungus. You guys can make theories and assume and try and put things together yourself, but it's never going to be confirmed, because having the origin of the virus in The Walking Dead confirmed to me inherently ruined the experience, and I don't want to inherently ruin the experience for other people reading my book because I've given a reason that they personally see as lackluster. Forget Me Not is also, much like some of my other works that I'm currently developing, based on experiences that I have had and that the people that I've existed around have also had. I very, very much like trying to understand how people work and sympathize with what they're thinking and feeling, and so I will take little bits and pieces of everybody that I know and conglomerate them into one or maybe two characters and really just play with the concept from that point on. I believe doing things like this is what makes my characters feel a bit more human than if I was to try and make shit up off the fly, but some people don't really like that, and so if that's not for you, then that's not for you. And with that, I think I've talked about just about everything I can without going too deep into spoiler territory. I hope you guys enjoyed this dive into my graphic novel. I know I enjoyed talking about it. I'm planning to have my next video be a sketchbook flip through where I show you guys the evolution of Forget Me Not through my traditional artwork. Though, like I said at the start of the video, I didn't have one singular sketchbook dedicated to Forget Me Not, so we're gonna be flip-flopping between a handful of different sketchbooks. See if I can try and get a cohesive timeline put together that way. It'll be very reminiscent of what I did in my SNOO announcement video where I announced my original plushie line and I showed you guys a couple of sketches through a couple of different sketchbooks. That's what it's going to be like. Alright, that's it from me for now. Stay warm, stay cozy, stay toasty. If you sneezed during the video at any point, bless you. And I hope to see you guys again sometime soon. Bye bye.